So I'm going to talk about affective charge and analogies today, with a focus on EEG methods. And so effectively charged analogies, we see them all the time actually in real life. You can see them in literature, you can see them in politics, you can see them. I've got a few examples here from public health communication. So we've got the seatbelt analogy for vaccines. And then some people say, that doesn't quite work. Then other people come out with drunk driving. So that's a little bit better because if you don't wear the seatbelt, or if you don't take, well, if you don't wear the seatbelt, you're at risk of dying. But if you don't take the vaccine, well, other people are also at risk of dying. So drunk driving is a better analogy. And then someone eventually asks, why are we so bad at coming out with these? And that's just the good faith people, because of course we've got the terrible analogies we've seen with vaccine mandates and the good old Nazi analogy, which we can't really avoid if we're talking about analogies and emotions, right? So the question that we asked even before the pandemic, and we had some reason to think it might be the case, is are we just kind of bad at coming up with effectively charged analogies? And that's one of the reasons why I undertook this research. One of the reasons we've got to think that emotions might influence analogical reasoning is just we've got a shared cognitive resources model. And to make it very simple, the idea is you've got some cognitive resources, attention, working memory, things like that, and you kind of need them to do analogical reasoning because it's quite a complex cognitive process. But affective processing can also take up some of these resources. So the idea is if you've got the neutral analogy here, well, most of the resources might be going towards analogical reasoning. And some resources, if you've got an affectively charged analogy, might be deviating towards affective processing, leaving a few less resources for analogical reasoning. So that's the model, and we've already got some data from other labs that tell us that this might be the case. There's research by Kristen Prind in 2011 who presented 4-term analogies, and they contained either emotional relations, conceptual relations, neither or both. And she asked people to identify the relations. So sometimes people had to say whether there was an emotional relation, whether there was a conceptual relation, and sometimes both. And what she found in her own terms is emotional relations were identified preferentially and faster than conceptual relations. So that means there is some deviation towards effective processing when you've got emotional content in your analogies. And there was an effect that was also specific to negative, analogies with negative terms, which is people were slower with these, and people also showed increased pupil dilation. So for those who aren't familiar, increased pupil dilation can be a sign of increased use of cognitive resources. So we can conclude from these, or at least it suggests, that negative terms can effectively appropriate cognitive resources that might be otherwise used to process conceptual relations in analogical reasoning. What we don't have with this research, though, is, is there an effect of emotions and affective charge on analogical reasoning itself? So they haven't shown something like people having difficulty complete or judge an analogy when the terms inside are negative. So that's what we tried to do. So I'm going to present a few examples of analogies throughout the test and throughout the talk, and they all have a purpose. Here are 2 effectively charged analogies. Chick is to chicken as calf is to. And you might be thinking something like cow. And is it effectively charged? Not really. It's more, we would call it probably neutral. Here's one that's more negative. So murderer is to victim as butcher is to. Oh, that's a little bit different. Some people might agree, some people might disagree, but probably you're also thinking cow. So the question I asked is just, is there a difference between how we infer the last term of these analogies when they're not shown at first? And my hypothesis was that negative emotions would impair the formation of these inferences. So here's one more. So cold is to winter as warmth is to. And you're probably thinking, not steam, probably not steam. So I just subverted your expectations here by presenting steam instead of course, summer. So what you're actually doing, the process itself, we could say has a few steps. The first thing is when you see cold is to winter, you've got cold, you've got winter, and here it's a very reduced map of the relations you might infer, but from these two you would infer the relationship season. So you're encoding a mental map of the structure of the four-term analogy here, which is we've got cold and winter, those are the terms, and there's a relationship between both, which is season. The next thing is when I show you as warmth is to, you're transposing this map. So you're taking up the relationship here and bringing it to a new domain, which is we were in cold, now we're in warm. Then we're expecting the season here. So after that, you're just going to infer the missing term. So you're going to think summer. And now you've got a mental model of it's probably going to be summer, right? So those are parts of the analogical reasoning process. The next part isn't quite a part of the analogical reasoning process as it's usually defined, but for this kind of presentation, it's important. It's you're going to compare your model with what's actually presented to you. And this comparison is going to be where we're going to get our data. So before I continue, I do have to say we're using EEG. Might be a bit strange to some people because usually we would, if we wanted to know like how good are people at forming inferences, we might just give them the first three terms and let them complete on a paper questionnaire, let's say, with the last word. And that's not quite what we're going to be doing here. We're using EEG, and there's a few reasons. Notably, this is the mode that would be usually used, murderer is to victim as butcher is to, and then you fill in the blank as a participant. But you've got a decision to make about whether you're writing it in, right? Because some people might not want to write it in for some reason. They might just disagree that the analogy is good. They might say, no, that's not, I'm a meat eater, and the butcher to the cow isn't really like a murderer to victim. So you've got some, you could have some use of emotional information to decide that despite the fact that there's a conceptual relation there, the analogy isn't really good. And we don't really want to see the decision process afterwards. We just want the inference process. It's also a bit difficult to control the time that we're allowing here for information processing. Whereas if we do it the way I've done it so far in the talk, which is murder is to victim as butcher is to, letting you have some time and then showing cow, the semantic networks about cow are going to be activated whether you decide that ultimately the analogy is good or not. So that's interesting for us. And also we've got some more precise control over the time allowed for information processing. So we can look at your brain activity 400 milliseconds after we've shown you the last word, and we can time the mental processes a bit more precisely. There's the why, but there's also the how, and here I'm just in the general principles. Apply the principles afterwards. How we do it is we create an expectation that requires analogical reasoning. I've already shown you how. Afterwards, sometimes we fulfill the expectation, so that's summer. Sometimes we defy it. That's, I don't remember what it was steam. So, and then we look at, we're thinking if the expectation is well formed, your brain will react very differently to summer and to steam. And if the inference isn't well formed, then that difference is going to be much smaller. So the size of the difference in brain activity between what happens at the end of a good and a bad analogy is going to be our index of how well the inference was formed. Now, I've said difference in brain activity, and that's very large because we could be looking at a lot of different things, but we targeted one specifically. So there's a specific brain activity here that we're looking for and that we're looking at to extract our index of inference formation. So there's something called the N400. Some who are familiar here with EEG might know it. Basically, if I give you a sentence, so I was really tired last night, so I went to, and if I say bed, you've got, that respects your expectations, and we're not going to see a big N400. So, and if I say college, so tired night college, oh, that doesn't quite work, right? So your expectations are subverted. And we're going to see a negative deviation in the waveform about 400 milliseconds after the word that doesn't fit. And if I said banana instead, now that's not even a place. So we're really surprised. And the negative deviation in the waveform is even bigger. So we have a good timing for this. We know it's 400 milliseconds. And we have a good expectation, which is if the expectations are defied or violated, there's going to be a big negative deviation in the waveform. And we can use that with the last term of our analogy to study the expectations. And actually I say we, but it's been done before and it's been shown that it works. So there's a study by McGuire in 2012 who did exactly that. And it was the same kind of design, present the last word by itself at the end after the inference has been formed. And the top wave here you see would be our summer, and the bottom wave here would be steam. So people could form expectations, and it was reflected in the N400. So what we're going to do is use this index and put emotional content in our analogies and see what happens. So I'm at experiment 1 now. There's going to be 2 because you'll see. We had 15 participants. It might not look like much, but for a long time it was standard in EEG studies to just have 16 or so. Nowadays we might, if we were to do it again, we probably would add some more. We made 128 analogies. So they're all verbal analogies like I've presented. If you're wondering how we did it, is actually I wrote them all. And I didn't write 128, I wrote 160, and then we reduced with the procedure in the lab, so we would have analogies that had a reasonable consensus. And that took a bit of creative effort, I would say. And what we did, we used this presentation, so fixation first, then cold winter by themselves. We instructed participants to interpret this as cold is to winter, so that's our first pair. Then second pair with the missing term, as we don't know what yet, this to summer. And then by itself, we presented the last word that sometimes defied expectations, sometimes didn't. And that's when we measured our N400 potential. And afterwards, we did ask participants whether they thought the analogy was sound or not. Just to make sure they were actually going through the analogical reasoning process. We manipulated the 3 variables, so the soundness of the analogy, whether this term here fits or not. Affect for the first pair, so that's cold is to winter. Sometimes it was negative, sometimes it was neutral. We did not include positive terms in this experiment. And we also did manipulate affective valence in the second pair here as well. So that's 2 by 2 by 2. You can guess that the statistics afterwards are repeated measures ANOVA with a 2 by 2 by 2 here. And then the last word here was always neutral because we weren't interested in emotions in the last word itself. We were interested in the contextual effect of emotions on the processing of this last word. And we matched all of our 8 conditions here for word length and concreteness in the last word here, because we know from previous research that distant influence and 400 amplitude. So we wanted to exclude these potential explanations. So here's the main result. So the difference between the 2 curves you see here is our N400 expectation effect. And it's here when both pairs of stimuli were neutral. It's also here when we had the third word as a negative word. And it's also here when negative content was first. But the N400 expectation effect disappears when we had negative terms in both pairs of the analogy. And if we looked at just the differences, this negative differs from both neutral negative and negative neutral. And that's the only difference we found. This here was not quite significant. So that tells us in the most negative condition of our experiment, our index of inference of the inference formation process here was reduced. So this seems to support at first sight our original interpretation, which is that negatively balanced content worsens inference formation and analogical reasoning, but there's a big or a but, or whatever you want, which is we've got a lot of uncontrolled confounders in this experiment. So we controlled for affective valence, concreteness, and word length only in the D term. We did control for affective valence for the other terms, but not concreteness or word length. There might be differences between conditions in which exact relations were used or how they were interpreted. So there's a big caveat to the first experiment, which is we used analogies as you might see them in real life. But as a consequence, our experimental controls are quite far from perfect.
Before you go on, there is a question. Christine Chisborough has a question.
Thanks, Margarita. Cool results so far. I was just wondering before we moved on if you could provide a concrete example of the different types of word pairs from the results that you just showed, or clarify them based on the examples you had used previously.
I could give you, I would say
like
I would say that the first cow one was a good example of something that would probably be considered neutral. I would have to look because we formed these according to, we use word lists, right? Because we have word lists where we know the affective valence. So we use neutral terms in the neutral ones and affective terms in affective ones. For an example of one with, I'm trying to think, because it's a little bit difficult because there's 2 places where we modify the affect, right? But one particular one that I remember would be something like, I'm going to use truth terms because we did in the experiment, but it would be something like crap is to anus as puke is to mouth. So you've got affective, like negative things in the first part, negative things in the second part, and mouth is quite neutral, and that's the term that people had to guess.
Okay, that's helpful. And then just to clarify your sort of operational definition of affectively charged in this case is just relating to affective valence as given by like indexes of affect for specific words.
Yes, if there's a word in the first pair or in the second pair that has an affective valence according to the word list that was under these lists out of 9, I think we used 3.5 as the criterion, then the analogical term is considered negative.
Okay, thank you.
So where was I? A lot of uncontrolled confounders, and the idea here is to do a second experiment and eliminate all of these. And actually, it's kind of surprising, but we can do it. And there's 3 important adaptations to do it. And the first one is probably the biggest one is we're not going to use words anymore. we're just going to go to symbolic analogies. So something like T-shapes are to T-shapes as spiky blobs are to, and then you have to guess the spiky blobs. And it can be a bit surprising, but for the analogies, those are still analogies, and the processes are the same, which is you can encode a relationship. Here, if you've observed well, you can see that we've just inverted the positions of the second and third T-shapes. And then you can map this onto the new domain, which is the spiky blobs. And then you'll expect to see the same spiky blobs here and those two inverted. I'm not actually going to show you, but that's how we would do it. We would make you create an expectation that isn't semantic anymore. And then we'd want to manipulate the affective valence once again, except now there's a little problem, which is you don't really care about the T-shapes and the spiky blobs, right? Those seem, at first sight, they seem quite neutral compared to my example with the anus and the puke. So we've solved the problem, and in true research fashion, we've created two more. The first one is those symbols don't differ in valence. And the second one is we used the N400 before, and the N400 is sensitive only to semantic expectations. So to the meaning of words, to expectations about what you're going to see as the meaning. And those are symbols. They don't really have meanings. So we can't use the N400. So first thing we're going to do is fix the valence problem. And there's going to be a snake on the screen in just a few moments. Prefer to give a warning. I have some people who are phobic. Snakes are usually not pleasant. So 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Snake. I don't really like snakes, especially those that are bearing its fangs here. This is quite negative. It's also not a symbol. It does have semantic meaning. That's a symbol. And now this doesn't really do anything, right? Except if I did this 20 times, what we've got is a conditioning procedure. So we show something, we show an unconditioned stimulus that can be negative or neutral. And then we show a conditioned stimulus. And if I do this 20 times, the spiky blobs, you're not going to like them very much at the end. And we can do a few things here as well. So I'm presenting the spiky blobs with snakes and spiders and natural disasters. It's not always the same image. Images we know are negative because we also have affective ratings for images in some image banks. And then we could present the T-shapes here with tables and staplers, which no one really like. Those are quite neutral. And I could also invert, and that's what I did, is for half the participants, the spiky blobs are with the snakes. For the other half of participants, the spiky blobs are with the tables and the staplers. So we can end up with just conditioned stimuli with which we can build our analogies. So far, so good, but we still need to measure non-semantic inference formation. And the N400 isn't going to do that for us. That's just how the component works. So we've got to find something else. And luckily, there is something else. So there's a thing called P3B. For those who don't know, I will describe like the main paradigm where it's been found. The main paradigm is there's 3 stimuli that can appear on a monitor, one at a time. So there's a common one. There's a distractor one, and there's one that you have to pay attention and respond to. So the instruction is just respond to one of these. And what happens is we've got a positive deviation this time that occurs after the visual stimulus of interest. So there's a component here called P3A, which is just sensitive to novelty, salience, things like that. And there's a component called P3B here, which is sensitive compared to the more common stimulus, which is sensitive here to basically expectations, like to task relevance, we could say. And it's a little bit more complicated than that, but we'll see afterwards, because I do have a reasoning paradigm where this has been used. One thing we also know about P3B, we know its spatial distribution very well, and we're going to use that also to identify the component afterwards. So here's a round image of a head. So assume that the head is a sphere. That's not quite it, but yeah. So that's the nose, that's the two ears, so, and that's the midline. The midline has FZ, CZ, and PZ in this simplified image. We did have a few more channels than that. But what we know about P3B is it's stronger here at PZ. And as you go forward, it weakens. So we're going to use that to identify, to make sure we've got the right component in analogical reasoning, because P3B hasn't really been used before this in an analogical reasoning task with the last term, as far as I know, and I checked. So what tells us that this is going to work? There's some research with other types of reasoning. Notably, there's 5 experiments that I found that all confirm about the same thing, but the clearest one I would say is the one with transitive reasoning. So it worked like this: A is to the left of B, and that was presented just with the symbols here, letters A dash B. B is to the left of C, B dash C. And now I've created an expectation. You're probably expecting something like A dash C. So therefore, A is to the left of C. And they can present this, or they can present the opposite. So you've got, once again, defined expectations here, met expectations there. And what happens on this graph here shows the results. There was a condition without reasoning. So that's just the control. And the blue lines here tell us what happens when people are actually reasoning and trying to infer the last premise before it's shown. And what happens is when you're defining expectations, the P3B is weaker. And when you're meeting them, it's more positive. So we're just going to use the same component here, but instead of transitive reasoning, we're going to do it with analogical reasoning. So here it's just the way we're making you form the expectations that's going to differ. And then we're going to look at variations according to affective valence. So same principle, our measure of inference formation could be said to be P3B amplitude when it's sound minus the P3B amplitude when it's unsound. So basically the difference here between the blue full line and the blue dotted line. So experiment 2, we did have to condition the symbols and make sure the conditioning worked. So at the very beginning of the task, we've got an effective evaluation of symbols. And this time we had 14 participants where the EEG data could be considered. We had 40 symbols split between 4 groups. So the T-shapes I've shown you, the spiky blobs, the squiggly lines, we could say, and the double V's, I guess. It's a bit hard to name them. They're symbols. They're made to be not really nameable. So we really have non-semantic relations. And we had participants rate them on a 1 to 7 scale. Afterwards, there's the conditioning procedure I've talked to you about. So that's 40 picture word associations, present the unconditioned stimulus, present the conditioned stimulus afterwards, and then next trial. And we inverted which series, counterbalanced which series was conditioned negatively and which series of symbols was conditioned neutrally. And afterwards, we've got the analogical reasoning task. It's the exact same design as in the first experiment. We still have 256 symbolic analogies. We still present the last term at the end. So you generate an expectation, and then we see your brain activity when we meet it and when we don't. And it's also the same timings and variables as experiment 1. So it's really just the 3 adaptations to the task that I've already presented. And afterwards, there's a second effective evaluation of symbols, just to make sure that our conditioning procedure has worked and has lasted until the end of the task. So I'm going to start with this. So there's a graph of what happens to our symbols. I've categorized them as either they were conditional neutrally or aversively. At the beginning, before the conditioning, of course, there's no difference between our types of symbols. And afterwards, we do have a significant difference. So people consider the stimuli, the symbols that have been conditioned negatively as more aversive on a 1 to 7 rating scale, going a bit faster. No, that's pretty much it. And the main results are encouraging. So this time it's slightly different. It was only the first pair of symbol groups that mattered for valence. And what happened is when valence was negative in this first pair of pair of 3 symbols, I guess we would say, then we had a decrease in our index of inference formation. And you can see it better here at PZ, where we did expect our P3B to be most significant and to therefore get the stronger effects of valence on P3B. So you've got here, we've got also a straight line and a dotted line. So it's the same code as before. Straight line is sound analogies, expectations are respected, the P3B is stronger. And here, dotted lines is expectations are not met, therefore P3B is weaker. So that corresponds exactly to what we had in the transitive reasoning task. And what we can see also is there's a difference here in the amplitude between the straight and the dotted line, which corresponds to our index of inference formation and analogical reasoning. And what happens is actually there's a lower sensitivity from the brain to analogical soundness when the terms are negative. So this kind of goes with what we had in the first experiment. So we can summarize the whole project here is as such. When people view an incomplete analogy, they infer its unknown part, as you've probably done when I have presented incomplete analogies to you. We can estimate how well they infer this unknown part. We do that by showing them the correct or an incorrect term at the end and looking at the difference in brain activity between both situations. If there's a lot of difference between a sound and non-sound analogy, then your inference process is going well. And if there's not a lot of difference, then your inference process seems to be a bit weaker. So the difference is smaller when the analogy contains negatively charged terms. So that goes with our initial hypothesis that negative content can impair at least some EG indexes of analogical reasoning. So that's a task, but I do want to mention briefly that we're moving on with the task that looks at a slightly different question for the future of the project, which is, for now we've asked, like, do we reason differently about affective content? But that's equivalent to in the Nazi analogy, are we just bad at processing the Nazi analogy? But another question that's very interesting is just, does the Nazi analogy influence our affects? So is there an emotional transfer of information when you see an analogy? And is this transfer different? Is this transfer basically stronger when the analogy is valid rather than unsound? So what I'm going to be doing in the next few months looks a little bit like this. We're starting with a pre-analogy affective evaluation of terms, and then we're using the analogies to try to modify affective ratings or affective preferences. And at this point, we're presenting sound and unsound analogies, also with affective valences. And we're trying to make people map initially neutral targets to neutral or negative sources. And then we're looking at whether it worked. And we're going to be doing it in 2 ways. There are EEG correlates of affect, which we're going to be looking at. And there are also just the good old behavioral data, so post-analogy affective evaluations. That's what we're going to be doing next. And I think that's my talk. Yeah, I can talk to a few collaborators. So Professor Isabelle Blanchette, who's done a lot of work on Analogies. So I'm in her lab, and she's been very helpful while doing the current research project. Professor Philip Jackson, who's also co-supervising the next phase of the study. And Claude Zinn was a very helpful research assistant for the project, helped collect the data, made the symbols for the second part of the analogical, well, from the symbols basically for the symbolic reasoning task, and help process the EEG data as well. So, and project was funded mostly by NSCRC. Project occurred mostly at Université du Québec at Trois-Rivières, so the first part of my postdoc, and now I'm at Université Laval, and that's my talk.